How good is the Mandalorian, right? I've been feeling under the weather this week, so I took the opportunity while I was recovering to rewatch the first 2 seasons before I start the third. Instead of 3D printing a Mandalorian helmet like some fans, I thought I'd have a go at emulating the opening sequence that the newer Star Wars content has. I reckon this rainbow light on shiny metal effect looks pretty cool, so why not have a go? If you want to see how I did it in Blender, keep watching. To achieve the effect, we're going to use the Lannix design logo, which we made using Fusion 360 in our previous video. If you didn't do the tutorial, you can go back and do it now if you want to, or you can download the model from the link in the description. Download the rainbow pattern image while you're there because you'll need it for this shoot. Personally, I find using Fusion is the easiest way to make text-based 3D models. Unfortunately, Fusion's rendering is somewhat limited if you want to give your graphics a bit of extra pizzazz. That's why we've turned to Blender. It's free and it's capable of producing some pretty amazing results, like the short film Charge you see here. The only downside being is that it has quite a steep learning curve. I'm aiming to keep this tutorial quite basic so that new users should be able to follow along. If you are interested in a more thorough beginner tutorial though, check out the Blender Guru Donut series. That's the way I learned the basics, and he comes highly recommended by anyone who knows Blender. I'll leave a link in the description, but now, let's get started. So if you've followed along with the last video designing the logo in Fusion, we can open it up and we'll export the model in a format that Blender can use. To export, go up to File, then to Export. Make sure your output folder looks good, then go to Type and select OBJ. Then click Export. You'll have to wait for Fusion to query the export image overlords, but when it's done, you can click Done and close Fusion. Open Blender. This is version 3.4.1 and choose a new general workspace. Select the default cube and press delete to get rid of it. For now we'll keep the light and camera. Go up to File, then Import, and choose wavefront.obj from the list. Locate the folder where you saved the model before and open it. You'll notice that it's humongous. The export process changes millimeters to meters, which is why it's so big. We can fix that though by pressing N to open this toolbox and changing some values. First let's get it upright so we can see what's going on. We'll change the X rotation to 0. And we can change the scale by pressing S in the workspace and typing 0.01. Now adjust your screen to get everything back in frame. Press G to grab the model and press Z to take it upwards in the Z direction and 1 for 1 meter. Then enter. Now press Ctrl A, which will bring up the Apply menu, and apply the scale and rotation to get everything the way we want it. The scale should always be at 1 when the model's at its final size. Before we get ahead of ourselves, we'll set up our render properties. Go over to this little TV icon, the render properties, and change the render engine to cycles. Then change the device to GPU compute. Now click this icon, which is the world properties, and change the color to pure black. That'll do here for now, so let's get that camera where we need it. If we press 0 on our number pad, we'll see what the camera sees, which at the moment isn't what we want to see. So let's move it by selecting it either in the viewport or from the outline list over here. Press number pad 7 to enter the top view. Then we'll press G to grab the camera and move it over directly in front of the logo. Now press R to rotate and face it towards the logo. We can switch to the right side view now by pressing number pad 3 and adjust the scene into view. Grab the camera and pull it down until the back of it is slightly below the logo. Then rotate it upwards like so. We can split our view now so that we can fine tune what the camera sees. Go up to the top corner of the workspace and you'll see the cursor turn into a cross. Click and drag to the right to open a new workspace. In the left screen, press number pad 0 to switch to the camera view and zoom in so we can see better. We can then grab our camera and move it around in both screens so that the logo is in the center. Hold shift to slow down the movement of the mouse while making any fine adjustments. We can press this icon to enter viewport rendering to get an idea of what our render will look like as we build our scene. We can also toggle between materials, solid or wireframe views, depending on what we're working on. The render view will slow down your machine so we can switch views when necessary to speed things up. Let's add a material to the logo. Select it from the outline list here. Click this ball icon, which is the material properties, and have a look here. You'll see that the material we added in Fusion is still applied, but it doesn't look like shiny metal. We can fix that though. From this list of sliders, we'll crank the metallic up to 1 and then change the roughness to 0.065, which isn't rough at all, it's quite shiny. You'll see in the rendered viewport that it does in fact look like a shiny metal already. We can find the light in our right viewport and move it around and see the effect it has. But now we're going to add our own lights. To do this, we'll stay in our right viewport and press Shift A to add a mesh and choose plane. Change the X dimension to 5 meters and the Y to 0.2 meters. Press numpad 3 to go into the right side view and grab the plane and move it just behind the camera. Then rotate it so it's facing the logo. You'll see the fillets we added in Fusion 360 will pick up the reflection of our plane quite nicely. Now we're going to add a material using the shader node editor. To open it, we'll make the timeline bigger like so, and then drag down the corner of the timeline workspace to duplicate it. In this top corner menu, we can change the larger space to a shader node editor. Now in the material properties, we'll add a new material to the plane. In your shader node workspace, you'll see that some nodes have appeared. In the surface menu, click on Emission. We can press Shift A to add a new node in Texture, Image Texture. Move it to the left of the emission node and connect the color output to the color input on the emission node, which will give you a purple light. Now rotate your view so you can see the plane from behind the logo model. If you haven't already, now's about the time to download the rainbow pattern image linked in the description. Once you have, click on the folder icon and find the image, then add it. Let's crank the strength up to, let's say, 3. We'll change the right viewport to the materials view. And with our plane still selected, we can press Shift D to duplicate it and press Z to drag it up in the Z direction. Face it towards the logo, and if we change our Y rotation to 180 degrees, we'll get a more interesting rainbow effect. We can fine tune our X rotation, and let's get rid of this old light. Then we can tweak the rainbow light positions, and they're done. Now we can add the teal and orange lights that we can see in the second half of the clip. That's simple enough. With our top rainbow light selected, we can press 3 to enter the right view and then Shift D to duplicate it. We can then move it around until we can see a definite reflection along the top of the logo, like so. In the material properties menu, we can press minus to remove the rainbow light material and then add a new material. Change it to emission and then change the color. I've used a teal that I've used in all my YouTube logos, but you can use whatever you want. You can use the hex codes that I've used if you want to duplicate the colors exactly though. Repeat the process to duplicate the bottom rainbow. Move it into position, give it a new material and change the color. It's always a good idea to rename your planes so you can keep track of them. Lastly, we'll add the lights that fly past the logo. They're just planes like we've already made, so we can duplicate the orange light and reset the angles. Now go into the material properties and remove the orange shader. Add a new one and change it to emission, then we'll rotate the plane to an angle like so. Move it up slightly and change the Y dimension to 0.1. We can see that it's not showing up in front of the teal light, so let's move it close to the logo by changing the Y location to -0.2. In this position, it will show up on camera when it whooshes by, but there is a way to set it up so that only the reflection is rendered. We'll go to Object Properties, the orange box, and under Visibility, we'll uncheck the camera checkbox. Now when we run off a render, it's transparent. So we have our scene set up, now we're going to make it dynamic. But firstly, since we're dealing with time, we should set a duration for our clip and a frame rate. And we'll set the resolution while we're at it. Go to the output properties, which is the icon that looks like a printer. I like to work in 4K, so I'll use 3840 by 2160 for my resolution, but you can stick to the default HD if you want to. Of course, working in 4K will increase your render time significantly, so you'll need to do a cost-benefit analysis to work out how you want to move forward. We'll choose 30 FPS for our frame rate and set the frame range end to 300, which will give us a 10-second clip. We'll come back and set some more output settings later when it's time for our final render. Now we'll make the teal and orange lights fade in gradually from about halfway into the clip. We can achieve this more easily by working backwards. We'll click the top of the timeline at frame 270 to move the cursor to that frame. We could also click here and type 270 to do the same thing. This will be the brightest point for the lights. We'll change the strength to 5 in the emission shader, and while the mouse is hovering over the strength slider, press I to insert a keyframe. You'll see the bar turn yellow if you've done it right. Repeat the same process for the teal light. Now move the cursor to frame 150 in the timeline and change the strength slider to 0. Press I to add another keyframe and repeat for the orange light. To see it in action, click around here on the timeline and press the space bar to run the animation. Running it in rendered mode will look a little noisy, but you should be able to get a feel for how it will look. Now we'll go into our graph editor to make the intensity ramp up a little better. Click in the top left corner drop down and select graph editor. Deselect the nodes by clicking anywhere on the screen and then select the left hand node. Enter the following in the active keyframe toolbar: left handle 110 and 0, right handle 280 and 0. For the right node, enter 260 and 0, then 310 and 17. And we'll need to repeat all that for the teal light. But first let's check out what difference our change made. Press the spacebar to run the animation and we can see that it slowly ramps up at the start and all of a sudden becomes more intense, which is what I was after. So we can enter the same values for the teal light now. It would be quicker to do all this before duplicating the orange light to create the teal one and then changing the color, but as a beginner it's good to familiarize yourself with the many functions of Blender, so a bit of repetition won't hurt. Now we can check the animation and we'll see that the two lights are in sync. Now we'll animate the rainbow lights, which we want to move past the logo to give us that nice color changing rainbow effect. We'll have them zoom in from opposite sides of the frame and slowly pass by the logo. Then as the orange and teal lights start to come on, we'll have them take off out of the frame. So let's move to frame 90 and we'll position the lights for the slowdown portion of the move. Select the bottom light and change the X location to -2.5 meters and press I while your mouse is hovering over the X location slider to make the keyframe. Move the top light to X location +2.5 meters and add your keyframe. Now we can move to frame 1 and keyframe the starting positions for both lights. With the top light still selected, change its X position to 15 meters and hit I to keyframe. Then change the bottom light X location to -15 meters and keyframe it. We'll then switch to frame 150 and change the bottom light X location to 2.5, add your keyframe and then keyframe the top light at -2.5 meters. Lastly, we'll move to frame 300 and add a keyframe at -25 meters for the top light and +25 meters for the bottom. Now let's get our graph into view. If we press the space bar to run the animation, we can see that the lights slow down while moving past the logo and then speed up again, which is what we want. But if we zoom out, we can see that they take off smoothly at the start and come to a halt at the end. We want to give them a starting and ending velocity, so with our bottom light selected, we'll go into our graph editor and change some handles. The red line in the graph represents a light plane's position in relation to time. While the line is horizontal, the light is stationary, and the steeper the line is, the faster it's moving. If we drag the right handle down, something like this, there's no need to be too precise, we'll have our ending velocity. And if we drag the left handle upwards, we'll have a starting velocity. So now if we run our animation, we can see the effect of our changes on the lower light plane. Now we can just repeat that process for the top light. Again, we don't need to be too precise. As long as we have a constantly moving light, it'll look pretty in our final render. The last thing we want to put in motion is the whoosh light, or lights, since we're going to make two of them. That's the white angled plane that we made earlier. We'll set the timeline to frame 185 and check that the whoosh light is at X location 4 meters and Y location -0.2 meters. Hover the mouse over the X location and press I for your keyframe. Move to frame 275 and set the X location to -4 meters, then press I again to add another keyframe. To add the second whoosh light, just hit Shift D, then enter, and drag the keyframe diamond on frame 185 to frame 183. If we then check our timeline, we can see that in the middle of their motion, they are 2 frames apart. Alright, animations are done. Now we can add some nifty after effects to our render. Move the timeline to anywhere after frame 270 where our coloured lights are at their most intense, and we'll visualise our effects using the rendered image. Switch to the compositing workspace by clicking up here. Let's get rid of this dope sheet and the toolbox by pressing N. Now we'll split the viewport like so, and we want to change one side to be the image editor and choose our subject here to be the render result. If you haven't run off a render yet, just press F12 and wait. We'll check use nodes here and click anywhere to deselect and make some space between the nodes. I'm going to follow the Blender Guru's workflow and add some glow the way he outlines in his donut compositing tutorial because it looks pretty good. First we'll add the bloom or blur, whatever you want to call it. We want the orange and teal to glow when they're at their most intense, so we'll first go over to our View Layer Properties tab and turn on the Glossy Direct Light with this checkbox. Blender Guru has an explanation of why we want to do this, but I'm not going to explain it too much. Basically it just isolates the brightest parts of our render, which we can then blur and overlay to make a glowy bloom effect. You may have noticed that this gives us an extra output on our render layers node, which we can plug into our blur node. Let's add that blur node by pressing Shift A and in the filter menu, click blur. Drag out this glossy direct output and drop it in the image input on your blur node. Press Shift A again and add a mix node from the color menu and drop it on the connection here. Now connect the dots here. You'll see that not much happens, but that's because we need to run off another render to get that glossy direct information. So hit F12 and wait again. When it's done, we can switch back to our workspace and we'll have our render waiting for us. We need to change our mix node to add and then make our blur values set to relative, and let's crank them up to say 5%. Whoa, now we got some glow. Let's tweak some numbers and get something that looks a bit less like a big night out. We can add an RGB curve from the color menu, which will give you more glow on the bright parts and less on the dark. Just shape the curve into an S for that effect. That allows you to crank up the blur values a bit more if you like. I'm going for an 80s themed look, so I think a little over the top will be fine. You can play around with the numbers all you want and find something you like. Having different values in the X and Y can give you an interesting effect. Lastly, we can add a lens distortion node from the distort menu. The distort slider will simulate lens barrel distortion that all cameras have. We only need very small values for this. 0.005 is enough there. Dispersion will add chromatic aberration, which is this color bleeding effect you see in old videos and photos, which I think really adds to the 80s theme I'm going for. 0.01 is about what we're after. Alright, let's get ready to render this thing. Rendering this 10-second clip in 4K took my machine about 2.5 hours, so be prepared to wait a while. Before we start, we'll need to tweak a few numbers. In the render properties, let's change the noise threshold to 0.02 and up the max samples to 8192. With a 0.02 noise threshold, it should stop before it gets to 8192 samples, and the denoiser will clean it up nicely, so we'll keep it enabled. Under Performance and Final Render, let's check Persistent Data to reduce data loading times. While we're here, we'll turn on the motion blur, which won't help with render times, but it will make the result look cooler. Now we need to finish setting up our output properties. Choose a folder to send all of your frames to, preferably one with nothing already in it. We'll use the file format OpenEXR to render our individual frames, and when we're done we'll come back and compile them into a movie clip. The rest of those settings are fine, so now we can hit Ctrl F12 to render our animation. This will probably take you a few hours, but it depends on your machine. We were getting 30 seconds a frame before, so that's 2 frames per minute, 150 minutes, 2.5 hours, although the early frames will be quicker since they don't have as much to render. It's best to leave the machine alone while it's rendering. Maybe go watch The Mandalorian or something. Now let's compile all those frames you just rendered into a video file. For that, we'll need to open a new document with File and New. Select Video Editing as the type. I like to set the format first, so we'll match the resolution to our frames, which was 3840 by 2160. Frame rate was 30 FPS, and we'll set the end frame to 300. I think we'll add our renders now, so let's go over here and check our cursor is on frame 1, then go to Add and then Image Sequence. Find the folder that you saved your frames in, make sure they're in numerical order and press A to select all of them. Then click Add Image Strip. Now let's specify a folder to output our video file. You can use the default folder if you like though. Lastly, we can use FFmpeg video as our file format, but in the encoding drop-down we'll change the output quality to perceptually lossless. This will create a larger file, but if you want to have a decent looking clip to use for YouTube, this is the way.
This is the way.
Now press Ctrl F12 and your video will be done in a minute or two. Now you know how to make your own videos in Blender, the world is your oyster. I've gone a bit crazy making all sorts of variations on the logo clip for my planned videos. And it seems the more you do, the more ideas come to mind where you can use it for transitions and different video topics. If you've followed along and made your own video, please share a link in the comments. I'd be super keen to check it out. I hope you enjoyed the video tutorial, and I hope you come back and check out my new videos as I upload them. Here's cheers.